As I put more time into Monster Hunter World, I come across new weapon types and armor, and being the person that I am, I can't really help but overanalyze them. So this time I've decided to overanalyze it again, but this time with my camera on. Today's focus of my over-analytical thinking is the Wyvern Blade. Now personally, the Wyvern Blade tree is one of my favorite in Monster Hunters. We're going to be looking at Wyvern Blade as a whole, not necessarily each or the individual Wyvern Blade like Leaf, Verde, or Fall, because they all are really the same design. They're just the stats are what vary, and I'm looking up the design. So with that being said, I really like the way they look. I like the way they use in the game, but how usable would they be in real life? Now, like with the Kestodon Guard video I did, I'm going to start by looking at this in a historical human versus human sense, and then I'm going to move on to the more fantasy human versus monster context. So, without further ado, let's get into it. The first thing that I noticed about this sword is its insane length. Now, there were some quite large swords used in historical battlefields, but even those swords stayed at a usable length of about the user's height. But still, the Wyvern Blade doesn't look to be too much larger than the user within the game, so it would still probably be usable, but with some difficulty. However, for the sake of this video, let's just pretend that the sword is the length of a standard longsword, say about 45 inches. With that in mind, let's move on to the blade. There's not much to say about the blade, as it looks pretty standard for a single-edged sword. However, the one thing that does strike me as odd is that little forward pointing spike about midway up the blade. And if this were a double-edged sword, I would have instantly freaked out, like, no, 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 absolutely not. But since it's a single-edged weapon, I think it's okay. In fact, I think it actually could be quite useful. For a starter, it could act like the crossguard on a boar spear, which would prevent the opponent from moving further up the blade once impaled. Secondly, and a more prominent use of the little forward pointing spike when fighting another human would be that you can use it to catch an opponent's blade, and since you'd be using the spike to catch an opponent's blade, you'd actually be pairing with the back of your sword, the spine, which would actually save your sword's edge from damage, since you're not doing edge-on-edge parrying. Now onto the hilt. The most prominent feature of that are the 3 large spikes sticking out from the guard. And most fantasy designs actually fail just to the odd number of spikes and weird protrusions and whatnot. However, this doesn't. For starters, the spikes actually point away from the user, so it's not a danger to the person using the sword. And secondly, the spikes could actually act as a type of guard or sword breaker for catching an opponent's blade and twisting it and locking your blade in place with theirs to prevent them from moving their weapon, or even just maybe potentially disarming them. Also, the spikes form a true crossguard, which would add to the effectiveness of pairing with the spine of your blade again, so that if you miscalculate and the spine of your blade strikes the opponent's weapon past the little forward turn spike that we mentioned earlier, it would still hit that section of the crossguard and leave your hands protected. Not to mention the added lethality to the murder stroke. Unfortunately, the grip and pommel portions of the sword completely undo all the good things I've said about this blade and the actually effective usefulness of spikes. When using a longsword, you generally want to grip the weapon up here close to the guard and then either near or on the pommel. And the spikes on the end of the pommel of the Wyvern Blade would make doing this a tad bit painful. Furthermore, the division in the grip would actually prevent you from being able to slide your hands up and down as you would need to for certain stances and certain strikes. And again, there's also spikes that would not just make sliding your hands up and down difficult, but a tad bit painful as well. Now, onto using this sword to fight monsters. The extra length of the sword would actually be beneficial when fighting a monster for keeping your distance, and the extra weight, due to the extra length, would actually help you hit the monster harder. However, I still don't feel like it's a worthwhile trade-off, considering your biggest advantage when fighting a monster the size of a house would be your agility and intelligence, but we're not going to talk about that right now. Using a sword that is longer than necessary and therefore heavier than necessary would simply contradict your greater strength against these big beasts. I still think the forward spike would be beneficial against the monsters, as it would keep them from going too far up your blade. However, I think this would be less useful than versus another human, but still a beneficial feature. However, the extra guards in the spike wouldn't really do much against fireballs, poison tails, or snapping jaws, so there's not a whole lot of use for having them there, and at that point they just add extra unnecessary weight. With all of this said, the sword design actually isn't too bad, especially for the insane fantasy levels apparent in Monster Hunters. So I gotta say, way to go, Monster Hunters. I'm actually pretty impressed with this. Again, as I said, this is one of my favorite sword designs, and it's kind of nice to look at it and be like, oh, this actually isn't too bad. I mean, the grip and pommel completely, I think, made the design not really usable, but the rest of it actually wasn't too bad, and it's nice to see a good fantasy design that isn't too far from practical. Thanks for watching.